Well, welcome, Gary. I am so excited to interview you today and hear a little bit about your story and your journey through this process that brought you to where you are today. And I believe so many will be able to connect with you through what you share, and it will resonate with so much of us. And so thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Krista. It's good to be with you.
So, Gary, let's not jump to the middle and spoil it. I want to just start out a little bit, just give a little snippet of, how you were made, a little bit of your childhood, leading up to adulthood. What did that look like for you? What was your world?
Well, the most distinguishing features of it to me were, so I was born into a serious theological environment, and I use that kind of carefully as opposed to a Christian home. It was indeed a quote unquote Christian home, but the theology was one that I could not live with. And my grandpa Van Til, whose youngest brother was a co-founder of Westminster Theological Seminary, they were both great advocates of the Reformed position, which also includes determinism, which needs to be explained a little bit. But the bottom line practicality of it is that God only chose a certain amount of humanity to be saved. And Jesus only died for a certain amount of humanity. And the rest of the folks in the world, God didn't provide salvation for and were therefore condemned to hell. And no plan was made for them. And I became quite aware of this because it was an intense environment. I became quite aware of this by the time I was 6, 7 years old. And we went to church twice every Sunday, etc., for the first 20 years of my life in this environment. But I asked my mother at about 6 or 7, I said, Mom, you have 8 children. Which of you would you have brought into the world just for the intent purpose of sending to hell? And she said, none, but I'm not God. And God was the better thinker in this equation. Well, that really skewed my thoughts. And so I had to wrestle with that. I went to Christian school.
Yeah, that sounds like
Go ahead.
Oppressive. That sounds heavy. That sounds like a very serious weight to be put upon you, especially as a child. But then growing up as an adult, I mean, no one would know. That sounds sad, or either, depending on your personality, can make you more driven to pursue and to excel and to become that one that God would accept. It also reminds me, I worked for Jehovah's Witnesses for a time, and it sounds very much the same as Jehovah's Witnesses, just certain ones, at least in the beginning, they've had to change it, of course, because they had a certain set number. They actually had a set number of who could be able to go to heaven. And so then the thought was, then you will work very hard to be good enough to be one of those people. That still is the mantra, except they had to get rid of that number because they quickly exceeded that. And so then what would be the point of being a Jehovah's Witness if you can't be one of those within that certain number? So did it feel very oppressive? Did it feel very weighted for you?
Yeah, my mother gave me the gospel when I was just very young, and I don't know whether, in actuality I accepted it or not, because I was being coerced in a certain sense, and I really didn't think at 3 or 4 years old I needed to be saved. I couldn't really think of jealousy toward my sister as being astounding, but I became aware of these things, and I was presented with them day in and day out in a Christian day school and in church. And by the time I was a teenager, I just couldn't live with it anymore. And we had a teacher in high school, Bible teacher, who was a reverend in the denomination, and he said to accept this whole concept, you have to give up the test of coherence, and this is called faith. And I said to myself, this is called BS. And I just kind of phased out then, and I said to myself, I'm an atheist.
Mm.
Well, what I really was is I was a seeker of the truth, and the truth couldn't be found in an environment like that.
Mm.
So I went off and kind of raised my own innocuous hell, for the lack of a better word, and kind of enjoyed life for 4 or 5 years, and still sat in church on Sunday morning out of respect for my parents and never caused them any trouble, etc.
Mm.
And then I was drafted into the Army at 20, and that's where I met a God who loved everyone and a Jesus who died for the sins of the whole world.
Hmm.
And that was truly good news.
So, so you say you met him. So obviously, did he show himself to you? Was it people that knew this Jesus that you hadn't really experienced before? How did you meet him when you were in the Army?
Well, the impetus, the catalyst was I was in advanced training, and suddenly spinal meningitis invaded our barracks, and that was a very bad thing back in those days. They
Yes.
didn't know how to control it, etc. And we had one fellow die like almost overnight. So we were quarantined and isolated and told in no uncertain terms, don't you plan on going anywhere to, look for a civilian doctor to see if he can cure you. You're not going to the Army hospital to have a spinal tap to see if you have it, because today you could be fine and tomorrow you could have it and be dead in 2 days.
Wow.
So I was in today's terms a hot mess. It's like I'm in trouble because I'm on just this side of eternity, and I'm not looking forward to that at all.
Yeah, and here you're going preparing, for battle or war or conflict, and here you are stuck, just trapped in one spot and said, well, hold out and see if you live. I mean, that's like total opposite of even your mental thought of what you were going to do. Wow.
Right. So I'm running around the post looking for anything I can find. I went to the PX looking for Christian books. I went to every chapel that was, by the time I got off duty, they were closed, but the Catholic chapel had their candles lit, and I walked in there and I picked up whatever literature was around and I read it voraciously, and, I looked everywhere I could. And I was just in a mess for 2 or 3 months, and then I got a permanent party as a cook in the hospital there, and I ended up going down to the chaplain's office there, to the chapel, and the chaplain's assistant happened to have a tape ministry that he listened to out of Houston, and this pastor was teaching the books of the Bible word by word, verse by verse, line by line, and it was like, this is the information my overwrought mentality and soul needed. And he just taught me all this beautiful stuff about a God who was the savior of the whole world.
Oh.
And that went really well for 3 years until they kind of got off course and turned into not kind of a fundamentalist cult, I will call it. Just really, they wanted to control every area of your life. And then God was no longer a God of love, because that was too lovey-dovey, fuzzy-wuzzy. And he became a God of integrity. And he couldn't love any of us because he could only love the righteousness of Jesus Christ imputed to us. So the whole thing deconstructed, but we were in it, and we were in it as 20-year-olds, not as 40 or 50 or 60-year-olds. Those people could think their way out of it, but I was kind of trapped, and I had nowhere to go back to. So I was caught in that for 20 years.
So a lot of different religious aspects swirling around and leading you in different directions, obviously the first 20 years of your life. So as you left the Army, then what happened with your life in general? What was your plan? Where were you going? Did you have a purpose or a direction?
Well, at that point, I was so enamored with this new ministry that was truly good news at this point, that I really seriously, prayerfully considered going to seminary, but I had to finish my undergraduate first. So I was all on board with the track to become a pastor teacher in their terminology, because there was absolutely nothing more important to me than God.
Hmm.
And I kind of had a business track before I went into the Army. I thought, well, best case scenario, I ought to become a millionaire. And after I heard about this wonderful God, it's like, no, I'm going to pursue God,
Hmm.
because I could clearly see a track to becoming a millionaire. I had a number of people I knew who were such, and I knew I could do it too. And so I made the real choice. It's like, no, I'm pursuing God.
Wow, that's a big deal, especially in America. Well, let's see. I can see me going that way, but no, we're just going to leave the $1 million over there, and I'm going to go with God and whatever that leads. I mean, that's a huge. I mean, there was something definitely real and ingrained and buried deep in you. That hunger for that connection with God was obviously very real. To walk away from that idea of money.
Yeah, that was a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
crazy.
yeah, absolutely. So, so I got out of the Army, and instead of going back to Indiana University, where I'd matriculated beforehand, my oldest brother, invited me to come to Minnesota and go to University of Minnesota to get my undergraduate in Greek and history. And so I got up there like in July and was helping him in his new business. He had just bought a pizza shop and was rebuilding the business. And 8 weeks later, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage at 39.
Wow.
So I'm left there as a 22-year-old trying to figure out how to make pizza from recipes that only existed visually in my head from watching him do it visually. You know, like
Let go.
like, well, I was making pizza sauce all weekend trying to get the blend right, and I was making Italian sausage all weekend and feeding these pizzas to my friends and family, and seeing if it was close to what he'd been producing. So eventually I landed on it pretty closely. But and then I sold that business about 9 months later, and I went to Grace College and Seminary in Indiana, and I went there for a year and kind of ran out of money. And then I ended up with a friend from Grace College going down to central Indiana, and got into a small church that was like a offshoot of this ministry in Houston, except instead of thousands of people attending church, there's maybe 40 to 50. And it was like living life in a fishbowl, and everyone minded each other's business.
Mm.
But besides the fact that the Bible was rigorously being taught, and by rigorous, we went to church Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, and three sermons on, 3 teaching sessions on Sunday. So 6 hours of teaching a week. But in addition to that, there was a very attractive young woman there.
Now it's like, so why do you stay there? Oh, a woman. Now it starts to make sense. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So she had been listening to this Houston ministry and to this local church ministry since she was 15.
Okay.
And I'd been listening since I was 20, and we met about 3 years later, and after about 5 dates over 6 or 7 years, we got married.
Hey.
But it was dead on arrival. It's like what she would hear from the pulpit and what I would hear from the pulpit were 2 different things. And it was a very tyrannical environment, especially for a woman. I remember a couple things that really epitomized what was being said to women. One was they were chattel property. So they had no more rights than a slave or a horse in God's scheme of things. And then, most women aren't smart enough to balance the checkbook. So, if a woman's hearing that kind of crap from the pulpit, I don't care what kind of relationship you have at home. When you come out of that and take her home, you don't have a relationship.
Well, or you're going to feel the bad side of what she's feeling from hearing that. Like,
Yeah.
going to take it out on you because she's not liking this. And so very un-American. And so obviously very ungodly as well, because that is not what is in the Bible. But wow. So yeah, that would, yeah, you can have that natural attraction, but obviously that inner turmoil is going to cause turmoil, you know, when you live with someone and they are, you know, not being valued for who they are, and, you know, being told that they're not valuable in that way, that obviously sounds difficult, extremely difficult, lots of problems I can see coming from that. So I assume there came to a point you moved on from this church, and what were you doing financially? What were you doing to live in this life, to provide for your needs?
Well, eventually we were both reasonably successfully employed to where we had a uh, viable financial life, etc. And so we'd both been in this mindset, this organizational mindset for 20 years. And we were standing in a friend's dress shop one morning, and my wife had perused the latest season's fashions, and we're standing there, three of us, and I said, we start talking. I said to our friend, I said, you know, we signed up 20 years ago for this, to know Jesus. It's like, when are we going to know Jesus?
Oh.
And I contend, you know, that was my mentality saying I'm ready for more. You know, it's like I've tried this. It's like, you know, I've rammed my head against this wall for 20 years trying to break through, and I can't. And I'm not satisfied with this. I got in this to know Jesus better, and all I've got is Bible, and all I've got is someone running my life and devaluating my life just like my wife's life was devalued.
Hmm.
And it's like, this isn't what we signed up for. And I think, you know, I think God honored that at that very moment. And, you know, he was waiting for that. He'd been, you know, I use in my book how, you know, how parents with a new little child, they, you know, they do their best to coax the first words out of their little baby's mouth, and they want it to be dada or mama or whatever. And God is doing the same thing with us. He's doing everything possible to coax the first words out of our mouth to get us to respond to him. And finally I go, bah, bah, bah. You know, it's like I'm that little lost sheep, and, you know, and he's my shepherd. And finally he got me to respond. It's like after 40 years of pain.
And you know, like you said, you're going to go and follow God, and probably, you know, be a pastor, and here you are not, and you are banging your head against the wall, and and unfortunately that's when we're so focused on following what people say more than getting to know him ourselves. That's like, at least that's what I see of that. But so you're doing life, and you're still feeling kind of empty. You've got your wife, and my guess is it wasn't, you know, what fully what God had intended. So if you can move us further along of what's going on, and where did you go to find him?
So
And you find him?
we we escaped that environment. You know, we were taken out of it by the grace and provision of God. And we just within a short period of time went to what I call normal churches, and we found a very nice church environment at a Baptist church only 10 miles away. And we uh, we were there for a number of years, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. And our life, by my estimation, really took off. I mean, it's like, oh, now I can be the husband I wanted to be instead of this tyrant who has to have his thumb on his wife's life. Now I can be the father knows best, the Donna Reed uh, husband of those TV shows of my youth, and treat this woman the way that I expected myself to instead of the way someone else told me to. And things went beautifully. You know, I mean, things progressed, and I started my own business at some juncture in there, and it just took off wildly and kind of made up for all the lack and the oppressiveness of the cult saying you couldn't do this and couldn't do that. So God immensely blessed us in that regard. And so this progressed for 8 years,
Freedom.
and
How
I
wonderful
enjoyed it.
it is.
Yeah, freedom and everything well. My family kind of returned. They had kind of disowned me,
Oh,
and so they returned. They came down and saw my wife and I have baptism at the Baptist church.
hmm.
And business was good, friends were good, church was good. We had
Awesome.
we had a 14-acre hobby farm. We raised German Shepherd dogs for competition. Everything was going good for 8 years, and it's like, but
Yeah.
we went to this Christian conference during the holidays, and it was a really neat conference. And this fellow who had a prison ministry in Georgia was entertaining us, singing, guitar playing, and he said, I was at the prison in Georgia, and he said, I was testifying to these black prisoners, and one of the black fellows said, God loves even me. And that just kind of hung in my head. So the conference gets over after a couple of days, and I go home and I go back to work, and it's like, God loves even me. And I say to myself, well, I know God loves me. I've known that for a long, long time now, 28 years. And it's like the voice in my head said, no, you don't. You do not know I love you.
Hmm.
And so we had sat in that cult for 20 years and really didn't have a modern pop musical library. And so I've been looking around for music that I'd missed, because I like rock and roll and I like raucous music, etc. So I'm listening to all this different music I hadn't really heard much of 20 years. And one that I enjoyed was I Want to Know What Love Is, I Want You to Show Me by Foreigner.
Ah, yes, that was a popular one.
And it just sounded like a Davidic psalm. Like if King David was here today, he would sing that to God. And he would sing it with the angst that Foreigner sang it with. So I just go down the road in my route truck in my business, and I would sing that to the Lord. I want to know what love is. I want you to show me. And that was my magnificent blunder.
And I don't think that's what Foreigner had intended when they sang that song either. So that gives some great humor to, I believe, showing who God is in his humor of how he can use anything. And, obviously Foreigner is not a Christian rock band, and that was not their intent for you, for you to call out to God and know him and want to see him. But how I love how these interesting twists and turns of how God works in our life and can use anything crazy to draw us to him. And that's pretty cool. So all these years you're seeking him, you want to know him, but yet you feel you don't really, you know him, but you don't feel his presence. You don't feel what it is of who he says he is and who he says you are. So that's pretty cool. Through this Foreigner song, you decide that, okay, I really want to know that you love me. Okay, tell us some more. Where did this go? Because there's got to be more to the story, because you've highlighted, and so I'll bring it up. Obviously, you may have caught that Gary has wrote a book. And so we'll tell you more about that. But basically, there's a lot more to this story and a lot more details, and it is in this book, and we will share it in the podcast notes, The Magnificent Blunder. So the Magnificent Blunder, are you the blunder? What's the blunder? What is the Magnificent Blunder?
Well, the magnificent blunder is that my life was going right finally for 8 years. It's like I had really, I think, what every Christian wants.
Mm-hmm.
I think they want their marital life to go well. I think they
Yep.
want their professional life to go well. I think they want their family life to go well, and they want a nice home, etc. It's like I had everything I wanted.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
And I'd been a deep student of the Word of God. I'd learned Greek, biblical Greek. I knew Hebrew to some extent. I've read more Christian books than most seminary professors. It's like I got it, and God spoke to me, and the Holy Spirit, manifested and enlightened this stuff to me, etc. But at the end of the day, I just didn't feel loved, I guess. It's like,
You were missing the boat, basically. You knew you had studied all this information, but you were missing the heart of it all.
yep. It's like, and
Hmm.
what it was is I wasn't healed. I had a broken heart. And we have to have a whole heart in order to experience God. And whole heart as compared to broken heart, not like wholehearted, like I'm just this perfect person, etc. It's like, no, I needed my heart mended. And so I was crying out, I want to know what love is. Well, little did I know that to such an extent that I was crying out to love, because God is love, and that's the most unequivocal statement in the Bible. He
Yes.
would be nothing else if he was not love. A
Yes.
lot a lot of people start out saying if God's not righteous and not God's not holy, he's nothing. It's like, no, if God's not love, he's not holy.
Mm-hmm.
God's not love, he's not righteous. So it's like I'm crying out to love that I want to know what love is. It's like, well, I guess you want to know me, Gary. Oh, oh, that's painful, because to heal a broken heart takes surgery, and surgery is not unpainful. And
I heard
sometimes you can't.
I heard you say the comment that that we need to be divorced from our ego. And I thought that was a really great picture of, because that sounds painful as well. Divorce is not good, right? That's painful, but divorce from our ego. Can you elaborate a little bit on that some more, getting divorced from our ego and what that looks like, and what do you mean by that?
Yeah, you have to be careful using those terms, because there's legitimate ego, there's legitimate self. All these words are kind of ambiguous,
Mm-hmm.
so they have to be described or defined. And so we all build up a sense of self, and this is a healthy thing. Our parents need to develop within us a certain amount of self-confidence,
Mm-hmm.
a certain amount of self-esteem,
Mm-hmm.
and then we build upon it. And society tells us if you do this, you're successful, and if you marry well, if you have children,
Mm-hmm.
um, if you have a good job, if you live in a good neighborhood, if you think these thoughts, if you're well thought of at the local church, if you donate, if you give, if you do this, that, the next thing, if you have a superior mentality or a superior personality or superior looks, people traffic in these things. Well, those things actually become the things that we cling to and maintain in order to save face, because that becomes our false self. Our
Security.
real self is we are children of God,
Mm-hmm.
and we are loved infinitely by an infinite lover.
Yes.
And until we comprehend that we have everything we need when we are loved by the infinite lover, we
Mm-hmm.
are living within a false sense of self.
Boom. That's it right there. Boom. Yeah. Say that again.
Until we know that we're living in the auspices of an infinite lover, until we know we are loved by the infinite lover, we are living within our false self, and we are living an inferior life.
And that's a security that can't be knocked away. We can't lose that security. We can't lose that he either loves us or he doesn't. He doesn't stop loving us. So if we know our value and loved by this God who created us, that's a very secure foundation that nothing can knock us off of. But if it's based off of all these other things you talked about, that we read the word, we go to church, we have a good marriage, we respect one another, we give, we are active and are good people. If our security is in that, there's so many things that can throw a wrench in that and cause insecurity. So I love
Well,
that you said that.
yeah, life takes most of those things away or alters most of them, and death takes them all away. So
Yes.
you either die with Jesus or you die alone.
Yeah.
And and Romans says it, and we don't understand it really till we experience it. But the love of God is so powerful toward us that when we experience that love, it it's better than all the things that are thrown at us.
So what was thrown at you that really shook this foundation for you? You were crying out to God, but then something was thrown at you that threw you down the mountain? What was that?
Yeah, so I've been singing this song to the Lord for some time, and things developed in our marriage, and some realities were brought forth, and we dealt with them, some pain from the past, and we just kept dealing with them, and I felt good about it. And it's like there are some things I was deeply regretful for, pain I'd caused, and I came to acknowledge and was willing to deal with, etc. But one day, uh, basically, my wife woke up and said, I think I've fallen in love with someone else.
Mm,
Um, I never loved you.
mm.
I think I want a divorce
Wow.
after 18 years. And not so much after 18 years, but after 8 good years, eight
Right.
progressing away from the fire into a very nice life. So if she would have said that years before, it's like, I get it, I'm not a good husband, but it's
Right.
like, and and thankfully, one thing she said in this whole process of divorce was, Gary, I think you'd make someone a pretty good husband now, just not me. So it's like,
Wow.
by the grace of God, she said that, because that essentially told me that I had become a person worthy of her respect,
Hmm.
and yet I didn't have her love. So,
But yet, so when this happened, what are all the feelings and emotions that you were feeling because of this rocking your world, throwing you off the cliff? What were these emotions you were wrought with?
well, initially, it's like you're just staggered by it. And she was such a honorable woman and decent woman that I would have never, it's like the last thing I would have ever expected of her would be like a sexual romantic dalliance. And I think it probably would have surprised her too. And so that she had fallen in love with someone else, it's like, this is staggering, but it's almost unbelievable, because that's not her modus operandi.
Hmm.
She was never looking for love somewhere else. And then when I understood the circumstances around it, etc., then I was very angry with the man for, being the initiator of this thing, etc.
Hmm.
And thankfully, the Lord had taught me for 6 months to a year before that to love my enemies. And the way he taught me to do that was to pray for all the people in traffic that made me angry and gave me road rage. And not road rage, but like, could you just get out of my way?
I think we can all relate to that. Yes, yes, at some point.
So it's like, I remember going down the road. I had this route business where I had to service like 25, 35 stops a day, and I had to make time through the city of Indianapolis. And it's like, these people would be in my way, and it's like I'd get upset. And it's like, the Lord would say, pray for them, Gary. Pray for your enemies. And I'd say, these aren't my enemies. It's like, well, the way you treat them, they are.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like,
That's good. That's good. But
so
so
it's
besides anger, obviously anger and what courage and wisdom to be obedient and do that and pray for this man. But what are these other emotions that began to just pile up upon you because of this situation and this process?
well, there's anxiety, and there's guilt, and there's shame for the way you've failed in the past. There's anxiety that this thing is not going to be that it is going to terminate in divorce. We did end up going to Christian counseling for a year, and that was very valuable to both of us as individuals and as a couple. And so there was considerable hope. And
Oh,
my ex-wife actually said, well, Gary, I think you'll actually end up getting your way, having the marriage survive. But in the end, she just couldn't live with the fact that she had been kind of coerced by this cult pastor into marrying me, not me specifically, but
ah,
as an example, um, we had dated, and she had cut it off at some point, and we dated on and off. And then my Marine buddy brought one of his friends from the Marines into town one weekend, and so my wife, my future wife, and he began dating a little bit and corresponding long term. And then he came into town for the wedding of my friend and his fiance, and my wife to be cut off relationships with him on a Friday night. On Sunday morning from the pulpit, she hears from the pastor, if you keep rejecting your right man candidates, you're going to eventually go into reversionism and die the sin unto death.
Lovely.
So this gives you a sense of the fear-based tactics of this fundamentalist cult. So she hears this, and she, I'm not aware of this in my head, but she decides to give me a second look. And so that, that second look turned into marriage eventually.
So the foundation for her was really just out of fear in choosing you, not that she loved you. Like she said, she never loved you. She was doing what she thought she was supposed to do. And so that's where she went back to in choosing to reject you now.
Yeah, I remember her sister, she had 3 younger sisters, and the one liked me, especially liked me, and she was the youngest, and she came home from a date one night and saw us sitting in the living room in their parents' house, and she says, so are you in love? And she was kind of directing it toward her sister. And my wife was my fiance at that point. She's very introspective, etc. She'd be very measured in what she'd say. And she says, I think I'm in like, as opposed to being in love. And so that was degraded, downward from being in love. And I don't think she ever got beyond just being in like with me. And she did like me, and she did in certain terms love me, but she never had that falling in love experience. And she fell in love with this other guy, and it was like being on drugs. She'd never been on drugs like that.
It is. There's those endorphins. You get excited about this new relationship and how you're connecting. Yeah, it's real.
So that's what I was up against, and that's what she was up against. And she didn't have any real intention of marrying this guy because he was married with 2 young children.
Oh boy.
And I said, I know you, and I know your honorable thought processes. I said, you certainly wouldn't break up a marriage with 2 young boys in it. She goes, no, I don't think so. But she says, I would rather live by myself the rest of my life than to pretend that I love you. So, I mean, this is rejection. This is telling you you've made an 18-year mistake. And actually, we'd been invested in one, or I'd been invested over, 25 years with her. So this is like being told 25 years of your life is a mistake. Yeah. So my level of self-esteem, etc., was just gone. And and everything else had to come apart on account of it. Our business had to be dissolved because there was no way I could run it without her. And there was no reason for me to stay on her 14-acre hobby farm. It's like living there alone wasn't what I was there for. It was a place that I wanted. Yeah. Home was where my wife was,
So basically
everything I knew and had was.
Yeah, everything is gone. Everything that you thought was good is now gone. And you were on this journey of, again, I want to know you love me. So where did that go with God? How were you feeling his love? Were you angry with him? Or did you decide to start rejecting him? Or did you run closer towards him? Where did you go in that relationship with God during this losing everything?
There was no way in my frame of reference to get any closer to God. I was as close to God as I knew how to get, which is kind of all of our predicament, because God has to get close to us. It's kind of like in the old days, a girl could want to date a guy, but if he doesn't ask her out, then that's as close as she can get to that guy. And that's how it is with the Lord. It's like if he doesn't initiate beyond a point, we can try all we want. We can hear all the things from the pulpit about, drawing near to God, etc. But at some point, it's on God's agenda that he has to draw near to us. And I didn't have any way to do it. And quite frankly, at that point, no, I wasn't angry. I was doing everything I could to possibly save our marriage, and that wasn't working. And
Mm-hmm.
then when it became evident that it wasn't going to be saved, and my business was gone, and my house was gone, and my dogs were gone, my friends were gone, it's like I tried to go back to college, but I was in so much emotional pain, I couldn't even cook for myself after about a month. It's like, it was just, it's like, I couldn't keep two thoughts together. I was trying to figure out, my wife said, well, maybe I'll miss you and I want you to come back. And it's like,
Oh.
hoping, and it's like, I couldn't figure out how to think two thoughts in a row, let alone matriculate in an academic environment.
Sure, right. So, so moving on, how did you start to put the pieces together? Where was the beginning where you started to feel you could live again? What did you do to start building something, some foundation again? What did you do?
Well, first of all, I dropped out of college, and my youngest sister was single, and she invited me to come live with her. And it's like I didn't have any hope of living. I was looking at suicide on a moment to moment, day by day
Mm,
basis. It's like all my impulses. There was just no, it's like I don't know what else to do. It's like in the past, if something happened in my life, I could say, Lord, it's my fault,
mm,
and I could somehow try to confess my sins to God. And there's a certain relief in knowing it's your fault, because now at least you can have absolution from this and, try to figure it out and do the right thing. But there was no right thing I could do. And so I was just done. And it's like I was in so much pain and I never understood grief. And so this went on, day by day for 6 months. And finally, uh, I was getting, my sister would give me self-help books and they just make me see another problem in my life. It's like, oh yeah, I guess I got that wrong with me. What's the answer to that? There is none. You're
mm,
just a bigger mess than you thought.
mm.
And it's like one thing led to another. And then it's like, okay, Gary, this is your last hope. Peel it down to reading the Bible for yourself. Spend your time with the Lord with the Bible. Listen to this one pastor's ministry that had some benefit in the past, and go to Christian counseling, which this cult said for 20 years that counseling was of the devil, be it
Oh,
Christian or otherwise.
oh, wow.
So I had a very difficult time even thinking about counseling, just from like, this is against God's will. And it's like, well, I got to take this shot because I'm dying if I don't anyway.
Mm,
And that became the impetus for the Lord delivering me, because I went to counseling and I ended up with a counselor who was also a pastor.
mm,
And that was epic in the sense that I was so well versed in the Bible that some average counselor giving me Christian platitudes or suggesting that I consider this and that wouldn't have affected me. I wouldn't consider it, because I knew the Bible and the Lord better than they did. But this fellow he's about 10 years older than me. He knew the Lord, he knew the Bible, and he knew pain.
okay.
And at first it didn't go anywhere, because, we talked and, I tried to confess whatever sins I could find. And, basically he said to me, Gary, I think your sins are pretty minor league. He said, I just think this is grief. And it's like, I go, huh. I go home and I think, grief. I should be able to get up and live my life then, because I did not understand grief. It's
Mm,
like, if it's just grief, why should I have pain because this woman left me? I should be glad. And it's like, I just didn't get it. And so finally, after a couple months, I'm in his office and we're talking. And he's got his Bible open and he takes his coffee cup and he makes sure it's empty. And he says, Gary, what am I doing? He takes it and he turns it over. And I said, Cal, theoretically, you're pouring your coffee on the floor. He goes, that's right. And he goes to the Psalms and he goes to the passage where David pours out his heart to the Lord. And then he goes to another one where David complains to the Lord. And then he goes to another one where David makes his bed a water bed of tears. Well, I'd never been allowed to cry in my life. It's like
mm,
my mother, boys didn't cry and her daughters didn't cry. And it's like
mm,
crying was a very babyish thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I never knew how to grieve any pain. And, and I certainly didn't know that I could ever complain to the Lord about anything.
Hmm.
But in this fundamentalist cult, David was like the hero, so to speak, because he was bad to the bone. I mean, Saul wanted 100 foreskins before he'd give his daughter in marriage to him, and he went out and got 200 foreskins. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like David was a man after God's own heart, and we weren't too distressed by the fact that he fornicated with Bathsheba. We didn't like the fact he got Uriah the Hittite murdered, but by and large, it's like we admired this David fella. So it's like here, this David fella is crying out to the Lord. It's like I can get on this train. So I soon was going home and I was crying 2 hours a day just to get the pain out of my head, the physical pain, and to be able to even think two thoughts in a row. And to make the story shorter, I progressed from that over the next 18 months. The Lord took me step by step by step by step. And I did counseling for about 6 of those months. And then I just spent time in my study every day, hour upon hour upon hour. And that's, the Lord revealed himself in his word in ways that he healed me. And then he'd let me see it in other people's lives and books I'd read. And it's like, oh, I guess this reality was real, that the Lord did visit me in this way. And he did impart this perception to me. And then one day he actually showed up spiritually in my office. And that was just, wow. It was like that. I mean, not that that's a life, not that we have to have that, but at that point in my life, it was a life-changing event because he was my big brother and he was there to soothe my soul, because after 2.5 years in this suicidal anxiety syndrome, I was about to give up again. And all I did is I cried out, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I didn't know what else to say. And about 3 feet out from my desk to the left, I could feel a presence. And then suddenly I could feel the warmth going from my shoulder all the way down to my waist. And it was just, I'm not very charismatic, but I'm telling you, this was mind-boggling to me. And it had its intended effect. It's like, I will never leave you or forsake you was real, real big to me. From that point on, it's like this big brother of mine will always be here.
We've talked a little bit prior to this about pain and not really being able to really know his love unless we've suffered through some pain, and obviously what you're going through, because you wanted to know him. I mean, years of seeking him, and you did know about him. You knew things that he did, but yet here, not until in the counseling did you get to a point to see the part of him in Psalms, the part of him that met David after he had blundered, after he had done horrible things, and how God still called him a man after God's own heart, who still loved him and was there for them. And then you going through all this 2 years of suffering, and obviously, not to say you didn't want to come out of it 2 years prior, right? You didn't want to be there. So it's not like you didn't want to get out, but you had to get to a point where you were ready to see, you were vulnerable enough, because you had all this knowledge. You had all this stuff in your head of who God was, but you hadn't felt him like you are explaining this encounter. And there are so many stories that I have heard of others, bleeding out on the floor, dying, and just calling out Jesus. Now, did they want to meet Jesus before? Yeah, there were other moments, and maybe he did in certain ways, but only he knows our heart, and only he can see through those layers of protection that we built, or our own ego, or our own wisdom that keep him at a distance sometimes. But I love how you said you felt him, because I've been there as well. I have that experience twice with him of great pain. One was a lot of my own doing and partly of other people's doing, but I finally got to a point where I was vulnerable enough to say, Nothing I'm looking for, nothing what I'm trying to do is doing it. I need you to show me you're real. And then another time of deep pain, and I didn't even have words to say, and calling out to Jesus and him meeting there and feeling this weight lift that I didn't even know was there. I mean, I knew I was in pain, but I physically felt the weight lifted. And that's really that love that you had been seeking all along. Not that we feel it all the time, but you were getting closer to really experiencing that presence of his love, of how much he loves you. You were letting him show you. It wasn't what you did or what you could do. It was what he could do to show you his love, to make himself evident. And that is such hard for people to believe, right? Hard to, because you can't just write it out in wisdom. It's something to experience. And how beautiful that is, that this magnificent blunder, blunders of life, the journey of life, the struggles and the pain and sorrow of life. But yet, if we keep seeking him and calling out to him and actually just be in that moment and say Jesus, that he might show up and show us who he really is. So how beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I want to go back to that now. I want to throw it back at you. So you start to feel this and meet him in a different way. Then where does the trajectory go? Does this become your security, or where do you go from here to build off of that? What happens after this moment? Because, it's just a moment, but then what happens?
Yeah, well, as you're speaking to all that, Krista, I'm also thinking of kind of that's kind of the mountaintop experience of experiencing God, experiencing Jesus. And then I realized after the fact of these 3 years, almost 3 years of pain, of what the Lord was up to. Sometimes we hear from the pulpit, if you want to experience God, do his will and you'll meet him in his will. And that sounds good, and it sounds biblical, and it is.
Sounds lovely, yes.
But what's kind of interesting, and to give a contrast to the mountaintop, is so I went through these 3 years, and what the Lord revealed to me is he had me loving my wife intensely through all this. And I was experiencing the same pain that Jesus was in loving my wife. I loved her unconditionally. I loved her in spite of myself. I loved her in spite of herself. And the pain that I experienced in order to continue to love her after having loved her for 18 years was what virtually killed me. And when I looked at that retrospectively and realized, Gary, you're not capable of that. You don't have that kind of love. The love that you loved your ex-wife with is the love of God, and the same intensity that he had you experience and the pain he had you experience to love her is the same pain he goes through by being present in you every day and loving you and sharing compassionately the same gut-wrenching life experience that you have. And when I realized the intensity, like that was 3 years of the intensity of staying alive, and the love that made it so painful to stay alive, I realized how loved I am from the negative aspect. It's like this is how far your God will go to the mat to love you under any circumstance, because he had me go to the mat. I didn't care who my wife was. I loved her, and I was going to continue to love her because that's what the Lord called me to do, and I wanted to love her. I had that desire to love her. He gave me that desire, and to reject that would be to reject his person. And so he drugged me through this because that was his will, but he also drugged me through it to see how much he loved me, because that was intense. So you get the mountaintop of him being in your office with you and laying his hand on you and comforting you, but you also get the intensity of this, this our God is a consuming fire. It's like he consumed me. He consumed my false self in order to be full of love.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, so that was another
Mm-hmm.
healing retrospectively. And
Mm-hmm.
then he just walked me out of the forest of pain, which he gave me no insight that when it was going to happen. And finally, I learned to live in the forest with him as opposed to try to figure out how to walk out
Mm-hmm.
on my own.
Mm-hmm.
So he finally got me to settle down, and it's like, Lord, I might go broke. I only got so much money in the bank. I don't know if I can ever work again. I'm such an emotional wreck. It's like I'm going to be living on Skid Row. My sister's going to kick me out because I'm too crazy. And it's like, just calm down, Gary. I'm here. I got you in the forest. I'm not showing you the way out. I got you walled in, boxed in, and I'm in charge. And eventually, it's like I could calm down and accept that. And then it was him and I. And then eventually, he led me out over a process of months and back into a functional life of, a job. I went back to school, finished my undergraduate degree, went to some graduate classes, and then he brought another woman into my life.
Uh-oh.
That's worked out much better.
You've learned a lot. And again, like we all do as we get older, well, usually, you chose to learn a lot and grow a lot. So you met another woman. And so tell us a little bit about where you are today. Where has God brought you kind of full circle at this point in your journey?
So Michelle and I have been married for a little over 15 years. We actually met 16 years ago this
Okay.
Thanksgiving, and have a wonderful relationship and enjoy one another immensely. And in addition to that, I've kind of retired now from earning a living, from earning money. And the first book that, it's like, I like to write, I like to read. And one thing my counselor taught me to do is journal.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very, very beneficial for a number of reasons. But it also gives you the habit of writing and the habit of paying attention to what you're thinking and what's going on. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I enjoy writing, and I felt compelled to write a book about this journey. And I know that 90% of the people who read it will just see the ambulance chase or the train wreck. But I'm hoping that, 10% will see maybe God in my pain, but eventually I'm hoping that they'll see that God is with them in their pain and that he is awaiting their magnificent blunder. And I'm just trying to encourage them. It's going to happen. It's going to be painful, but it's like I finish up the book with Job. Before I heard you with my ears. And to me, that's like, I'm in a good church. I've got good friends. I'm getting good Bible teaching. I'm in a prayer group. I've got this, I've got that. I've got a men's group. I've got a women's group. I've got a, small group, whatever. Everything's pretty good. Before I heard you with my ears, Lord, but after you ran me through the ringer, now I can see you with the eyes of my soul. Now I can perceive you. Now I know you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the message that the church is not teaching the disciples. We're designed to be discipled, and we need to know the journey's rough,
Mm-hmm.
but we need to know what the reward is at the end. And we think these people are extraordinary. We think Abraham talking to God is extraordinary. We think Job is extraordinary. We think Paul and John and these people hanging out with Jesus is extraordinary. It's like, it's exceptional, but it's the ordinary. It's what's ordinarily expected of us as Christians to have that experience. It's, it's not happening, but it's the ordinary. And we need to know how to get there. And the Lord has to take us, but we have to know that the journey's painful so we don't give up on it and what the reward is. So that's what I've done. I felt like that was the first thing I had to do, was write that book, even though I felt very naked talking about my pain of 3 years.
Right.
So I didn't want to write it any more than I think David wanted to talk about Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. But I wrote it, and now I'm starting a second book, and this one is This one is about Jesus as the ultimate hero of history, and that's really what I wanted to write in the first place. But maybe the Lord needed me to write that other book just to finish healing some wounds and getting some things stated that I've said privately for years, but maybe never said publicly, and got them out of my system now that I've said it. Uh, so now I can kind of write about my hero, and so I'm enjoying that. It's a lot more difficult. I don't know my hero as well as I know myself. So.
Right, right. You're still learning. You're still getting to know your hero, right? There, you can't know him enough, I don't think. But
Right. So,
okay.
but it's quite the fun journey sitting in my study every morning and hanging out with them and having them speak words into my head and guide me. It's just where I want to be. So.
Well, I thank you so much for sharing some of this nakedness of your journey with us so that, you know, I think many people can relate to many different issues, and, you know, every one of us have different journeys, and they're all difficult. And either we can choose to look to God and try to find our way through it, or we can just keep muddling through and trying to figure it out on our own and see where that gets us. You know, those are our choices that we have through our journeys of life, because this world is full of a lot of pain and suffering, and some of it is on our own because of our own choices, and a lot of it has nothing to do with what we do, but we still must suffer. But I love you did say that he will never leave us nor forsake us. So again, if we could just, you know, that mustard seed of faith, choose to look to him, trust him, and see what he'll do with our mess, see what he'll do with our pain, with our grief, that he'll walk us through. But I also want to quick point out too, you know, if you're suffering, if you've been struggling, or you're struggling with grief or some other rejection or circumstance, that, you know, in every profession there are wonderful people, okay people, and horrible people at their profession. So if you've gone to a counselor and it wasn't good, we'll find a different one. There are good counselors that can help you to lean in and to help you process and pull this stuff out. Maybe get this book, Magnificent Blunder, and maybe that will help walk you through and open your eyes to things that you haven't looked at before. And obviously now we can look forward to this other book of how he found Jesus is our hero. And so I look forward to hearing about that book, and maybe you will too. So thank you, Gary Leap, for joining us today. Please check out the podcast notes to find a link to him and his book and his YouTube videos, and see what's coming later from his journey through life. Thank you, Gary, and we look forward to who we get to hear from next week. But thank you, Gary. You have a great day, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Krista. It's been great.